so, and there are often risks of interventions backfiring and having negative effects. Meaning well does unfortunately often not translate into good results. Today's session is co-sponsored by our partners in the Department for Transitional Development Assistance at BMZ and GIZ. It includes a brief presentation of findings from a new systematic review produced by 3IE, commissioned and supported by BMZ and GIZ. This one is assessing the effects of interventions to promote social cohesion. And this will be followed by a discussion of the role and use of evidence in the sector. The event will last for 90 minutes with about 30 minutes set aside at the end where you will have the opportunity to raise questions. Please feel free to introduce yourself to the attendees on chat. Your name and organization added to your introductions. As you must be aware and used to by now, there are a few housekeeping rules to these online events, and here are the main ones. Please use the Q&A box for questions, not the chat function. We have a team that is monitoring these questions and will be sending them to me. When sending a question, it is useful if you can name the panelists you would like a response from, unless it is a more general question to the panel. If the event is disrupted for any reason, we will shut it down and reach out to you over email. Also, the event is being live streamed on YouTube and shared on social media. If you are joining on our live stream, please leave your questions in the comments box. And do please spread the word about this series of events using the hashtag evidence dialogues. So welcome again, everyone. I will now introduce our panelists for today's webinar. First, we have Wale Osofisan, who is Senior Director of the Governance Technical Unit at the International Rescue Committee. Wale leads the unit's team of senior advisors, technical advisors, and specialists overseeing program support to over 30 IRC country offices. Wale has 2 decades of professional experience researching and working on humanitarian, development, conflict prevention, and peace-building issues. Prior to joining the IRC, he worked with Plan UK, HelpAge, International UK, and the United Nations Development Programme in Nigeria. Wale holds a PhD in post-war recovery studies from the Department of Politics, University of York, UK, and an MSc in Humanitarian and Refugee Studies from the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, University of Ibadan, Nigeria. So welcome, Wale. Next, we have Tammy Smith, who is Senior Advisor for Design, Monitoring and Evaluation at the UN Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund. Tammy heads a small team offering support on programmatic design, evaluation, data and analytics, training and knowledge management related to peacebuilding at the UN Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund. Tammy's professional life has been divided between international development, humanitarian action, and peacebuilding on the one hand, and academic research on the other. Before joining the PBF, Tammy served in several positions in UNICEF, including as Senior Advisor for Peacebuilding and Recovery in New York, and Chief of Social Policy and M&E in UNICEF's Yemen country office. Prior to joining the UN in 2009, she was an assistant professor of sociology at SUNY Stony Brook, focusing on conflict and post-conflict settings, gender and institution building. So welcome, Tammy. Next, we have Jörn Grevingholt, who is a senior researcher at the German Development Institute in Bonn. His research focuses on fragile statehood, peacebuilding, causes of displacement, and migration policy making. He is project lead on contested mobility migration policy in countries of the Global South, and also co-leads the data project called Constellations of State Fragility. He previously worked on post-conflict peace support and international aid to fragile states. He is a member of the German government's advisory board for civilian crisis prevention and peace building. So welcome again, Jörn. Next, we have Henriette Sachse, who is a senior policy advisor at the Department of Transitional Development Assistance under the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ. Her main focus is on policy and implementation of Nexus and cooperation with NGOs. She conducts field research and has several publications on transitional justice and truth commissions in East Timor. She studied international culture and business studies in Passau, Germany. She was a visiting fellow also at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. And last but definitely not least, we have Ada Sonnenfeld, who is an evaluation specialist at 3IE. Ada manages systematic reviews and evidence gap map projects, specializing in the fields of governance, peace building, and rural development. Prior to working with 3IE, Ada worked with the Aga Khan Foundation in Afghanistan, leading the design and development of new programming in integrated rural development. She has 8 years experience in international development across diverse contexts and has a Master of Science degree in impact evaluation for international development at the University of East Anglia, UK, and holds a Bachelor's in Honours International Development with a specialization in states and governance from McGill's University, Canada. So with that, you've been introduced to this amazing panel with a very rich knowledge and experience. Now let us move straight into the presentation by Ada of the systematic review on social cohesion. Over to you, Ada.
Great, sorry, I couldn't see the mute button, it disappeared. Thank you all very much for joining us today. I'm really excited to share with you the key findings from a forthcoming systematic review of interventions aiming to build social cohesion in fragile contexts. So 3IE last year worked in partnership with DEVAL, the German Institute for Development Evaluation, to put together an evidence gap map of interventions aiming to build peaceful societies, which was generously funded by BMZ. One of the findings from this review was that there was a concentration of evidence of different types of programs that had aimed to build social cohesion in fragile contexts. There's a broad range of interventions that aim to achieve this goal. And the theory that unites them is that societies with higher levels of social cohesion may be better able to support and maintain sustainable peace. So we undertook a systematic review in order to make sense of this evidence. And the reason that we did that is because systematic reviews allow us to make sense of conflicting findings where they exist, to make research more accessible by bringing together all of the best rigorous research that we can identify related to a specific topic. They avoid waste in terms of making sure there's no duplication of efforts, and they avoid dangers of drawing conclusions from a single study that may not be wrong, but may be specific to that context. And so they help us understand what works, where, for whom, and under what conditions. And they avoid susceptible bias by making sure that we take a pre-specified approach to what types of evidence that we will include and allow us to identify relevant policy and programming implications and research implications that can better enable us to ultimately build sustainable peace. The conceptual scope of this review is specifically focused on horizontal intergroup cohesion. And so what that means is that we were specifically looking for interventions that aimed to improve the relationships between two different social groups within a fragile context, where there were tensions between those groups that threatened to spill out into violence. The definition of social cohesion that we used for this review is one of a state of affairs comprising the vertical and horizontal interactions among members of society through bonding, intragroup, and bridging, intergroup social ties that are characterized by a set of attitudes and norms that include trust, a sense of belonging, the willingness to participate, willingness to help, and an acceptance of diversity, as well as their behavioral manifestations. So this dimension, which is built off of the one developed from Chan et al. In 2006, identifies these 5 key domains as critical to social cohesion, and then looks specifically at the ways in which interventions aiming to build stronger intergroup ties may contribute to building a stronger state of social cohesion across these 5 dimensions. So we looked at 5 different categories of interventions. The search that we undertook covered 5 different academic databases and over 30 different organizational websites and databases from such as 3IEs, the World Banks, etc. And we ultimately identified 24 specific studies that met our inclusion criteria. We grouped these studies into these 5 groups that were built around the core components included in each. So for the first group, for school-based peace education, we identified 4 studies, and these are identified by their location. They're implemented in schools, and they're also unique in the sense that they target children and adolescents. The collaborative contact interventions were those that aimed to bring people together through kind of fun initiatives or things that were not explicitly related to building intergroup ties, such as through a vocational training program or a soccer league, and aim to, through this collaborative contact by getting people to work together in a more relaxed environment, hope that that will help them build a better understanding of people from the other group. And we identified 4 studies in this group as well. The next category of intergroup dialogue interventions incorporated elements of intergroup contact, but also facilitated dialogue sessions where people were brought together to talk in a facilitated and safe space about the ways in which they differed and the ways in which they were similar, and tried to heal the divide across them. And we identified 6 studies that were related to this category of intervention. The next section is one of interventions that brought together a variety of different approaches to building intergroup social cohesion. These included elements of workshop-based peace education that targeted adults in the community and community leaders, as well as elements of intergroup contact and also in economic support. And it's important to note that these interventions weren't aiming to really influence economic outcomes through the economic interventions that they included, but rather to use that as a catalyst for bringing people together and giving them something to work on in a collaborative way. Finally, we identified, and there were 5 studies in that group. Finally, we also identified 5 studies that related to media for peace interventions. 4 of these were edutainment interventions of radio drama programs, and the 5th was of a kind of counter-narratives based media campaign. So that is the sample on which we based our study. The majority of studies took place in sub-Saharan Africa. You can see from this map that almost all of the included studies took place on this continent, although we did also have 4 studies from the Middle East and North Africa, and 4 further from Europe and Central Asia. The country with the largest number of impact evaluations related to these types of interventions was Nigeria, which had 4 impact evaluations. So what did we find? So this table presents a lot of information at once. So I want to talk you through a little bit about what it means and then highlight some of the key findings very briefly, because mostly we want to focus on our brilliant panelists and their input today. But just to give you a sense as to what we were finding, ultimately, we were able to identify small positive impacts of the different types of interventions aiming to build social cohesion across the 5 dimensions. Where there's a star-shaped thing that shows you a number there, that's the Hedges G of a meta-analysis that we were able to run. So the first thing to note is there's a lot of blank spaces. And what that means is not that we didn't find impacts, but that there's actually quite a bit of variance in terms of which studies reported effects on which domains of social cohesion across our review. So even though we'd made a big effort to try and make sure that we were looking for studies that were implementing similar types of interventions on similar types of outcomes, there was still a really broad range that made synthesis from a statistical perspective quite challenging in many of the cases. So where we were able to identify at least 3 studies of similar outcome constructs, we ran a meta-analysis, and you can see the findings there. The gray boxes are those where there was a positive result if it's a positive number, or a negative it's in red, but where the 95% confidence interval crossed the line of no effect. And what that means is that we can't be 95% sure that the true effect wasn't 0. So what you can see here is that we found positive impacts of collaborative contact interventions on a willingness to participate, of workshops, contact econ interventions, and media for peace on outcomes of trust, and that we found weakly positive but insignificant effects of workshops, contact econ on a sense of belonging and willingness to participate, and of media for peace on acceptance of diversity. With the intergroup dialogues interventions, we didn't find any positive impacts, although it's worth noting that the negative numbers here are driven by a single study in which we have very little confidence due to serious risks of bias within the specific study. So we don't set too much weight by those findings. And it's also worth noting that amongst the school-based peace education studies, due to missing data in some of them, we weren't able to run meta-analyses of these studies, but they did have some of the strongest effects on trust and a willingness to help from within the included studies. However, we also identified instances in which the studies had negative effects. The 2 main examples from that is there's one school-based peace education study that took place in Kyrgyzstan, which found a negative impact on a sense of belonging. And this study also identified a negative impact on especially girls' sense of confidence. And the way the authors interpreted this helped with qualitative evidence from focus group discussions and interviews that they conducted, was that they decided that the intervention had likely been too short. So it had helped the children who were participating and the adolescents participating to realize the dangers of judging people from other groups and see the damage that can be caused from discrimination, but it hadn't gotten to them to a place where they felt empowered to do something about that in a positive way. And so these negative impacts on a sense of empowerment and confidence and a sense of belonging at a national level show that we have to be quite careful, because these interventions, while they have the potential to achieve positive impacts, do also have the potential to, at least in the earlier stages, do harm if we're not careful. And the other main example of that was from an intergroup dialogue intervention that, while it found positive impacts on intergroup measures of a sense of willingness to participate and of trust, it had found a negative impact on survivors of violence and conflict on their post-traumatic stress disorder. And so even though there had been positive outcomes at an intergroup level, at a personal and individual level, participants had actually had a negative impact on their mental health. So that's another important thing to keep in mind when we undertake these types of interventions. We also looked to try and understand what could explain the different findings that we had. What were the barriers and facilitators that were associated with stronger or weaker program effects? And so here are the 6 key factors that we identified that can help explain the findings that you saw on the previous slide. One thing that I want to highlight is that very few of the studies undertook conflict assessments. And this was surprising to us because we know that in this field, that's a very common practice, but it doesn't seem to have been undertaken alongside or in the design of the studies that were evaluated through rigorous impact evaluations. And what we saw, the implication of that was that there were many situations in which there was an issue in identifying the appropriate bottleneck to intergroup social cohesion at a local level. So whereas an intervention might have been really well designed from a theoretical perspective, it wasn't really addressing the participants that it was, the needs of the participants that it was targeting. And this is something that a conflict assessment or a diagnostic or even just a baseline needs assessment can really help make sure is the case. Similar to the challenges that I noted earlier, longer and nonlinear causal chains may be a barrier to substantive improvements. But we also noticed that smaller scale interventions may not provide sufficient intensity of intervention in order to have effects beyond direct participants. That doesn't mean that these interventions aren't valid. It just means that when you're thinking about how you evaluate the success of a program, if it's a smaller scale intervention, it may make sense just to focus your evaluation on direct participants and not expect to see changes at a higher, more community or regional level. Finally, we noticed that there was a lack of substantive changes in some cases to intermediate social cohesion, and that may be a breakdown towards changes across the 5 domains of social cohesion. So what does that mean for policy and practice? Well, though we found the isolated effects of these interventions are small, I think this review does show that it is possible to improve intergroup social cohesion through these targeted interventions, but they're only one piece of the puzzle. And these interventions alone may be insufficient, for supporting long-term substantive changes in building resilient intergroup social cohesion. And so what that means is there's a need for more complex interventions that draw on complementary strategies that address the underlying drivers of threats to human security that might be creating the context that spur people to blame their issues on the other group. And so maybe there's more work needed to have joint strategies, and there's more theory building work to understand how those strategies might interact. It's also important to think about realistic timeframes. It's also helpful to think about all 5 dimensions, because in order to enable us to understand how these interventions are affecting social cohesion, we need to know, are there certain intervention types that are better suited for one type of domain? So where there's a bottleneck, for example, in trust, but people do participate, maybe there are interventions better suited for that. But because there was such a scattering of which studies evaluated which outcomes, it was difficult for us to draw these conclusions in this review. The need for context analysis, as I mentioned, is a key implication. And finally, just more work on identifying what are the intermediate steps that come before we identify outcomes on the higher level: trust, willingness to participate, help, acceptance of diversity, and a sense of belonging. But what might be an intermediate outcome that says that we're on the right direction, we're on the right path? So those are the findings of this review in a nutshell. And with that, I will turn it back over to Marie. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ada. Thanks for an excellent presentation. I'm sure I saw the panelists nodding during it, and will recognize many of the barriers, challenges, and hopefully also help us towards finding some solutions. So basically, the moderated discussion will take us we'll take that for about half an hour. The panelists will address questions relating to the opportunities and challenges associated with evidence-informed decision-making, particularly in this sector. And then we will move, as I mentioned earlier, to a Q&A session. I haven't seen any Q&As yet, so just reminding everyone to please use that for questions, and also for Ada's presentation, but potentially you could get some answers online as well. Okay, so dear panel, let me open up with a question to you. In your experience, what is the role of evidence in informing policy and practice in the fields of peace building and transitional development assistance? and sort of maybe reflecting on how widespread is the use, and how is evidence used in this sector. So let me please let me start with Wale. Over to you for some reflections on this.
Sorry, I was also looking for my mute button as well, which is very, very typical. Thanks, Marie and Ada, for that presentation. A lot of the things that you captured actually resonates with what we see in the field of peace building. So, Marie, to answer your question, I think it helps for me to start with our overall policy position at the IRC in regards to what we're discussing today. So we do actually have a strategic objective which we set out in 2015, where we made a commitment to implementing high impact, cost-effective programs for people affected by crisis, and using our learning and experience to shape policy and practice, to shape and influence policy and practice. I will come back to how this relates to our work on peace building in a minute. But before I do that, I think it's important that I quickly talk about a framework that we use to inform program design, given it is directly relevant to this conversation on policy and practice regarding the role of evidence. So back in 2015, we developed a framework called the Outcomes and Evidence Framework, which anyone can access online. You can find it on oef.rescue.org. I think I got that right, oef.rescue.org. It's an open source, as we hope that it can help support humanitarian and development professionals to design effective programs. So the OEF, that's the Outcomes and Evidence Framework. We call it OEF internally within IRC, but it's Outcomes and Evidence Framework. It actually delivers key information on outcomes related to areas we're interested in. And this is health, safety, education, economic well-being, and power. And they all have theories of change. It also provides information on evidence for interventions that actually work and don't work to achieve those outcomes. So I was kind of excited listening to Ada, because it would be good to link you up with our research and innovation team on your findings, so we can add that to the OEF. So this is a framework that we use in all our program interventions based on 3 interrelated criteria. So we look at the best available evidence, we adapt it to the context, and we take into account client preferences, if you like, some organizations call it beneficiaries. So we look at evidence, adapt it to context, and we take into account the preferences of the people we serve. Now, where there is evidence that an intervention does not work, we simply stop doing it. And where the evidence is mixed, we try to build in a research and learning component to help generate evidence on whether an intervention or set of interventions work or don't work. As Ada was saying, sometimes you need very different interventions to actually get your outcomes, not just one intervention. And it's also very important for us, because what we also try to do is not just try to learn what works, but under what conditions and what mechanisms do they work, if they work at all. Because an intervention might work in Northeast Uganda, that same intervention might fail in Northwest Uganda. So we need to understand the conditions and the mechanisms to which they work. So if those conditions are present, we'll test it again to see if it works. Then, if it does, then we can be confident that yes, under certain conditions, this intervention works. If those conditions are absent, it's likely it's not going to work. Now, turning to peace building, we've been implementing standalone projects that we call conflict mitigation and management, funded by USAID. We've been doing that for over the decade. Some with some learning components built in, and some without learning components, just standard M&E. But since we introduced the Outcomes and Evidence Framework in 2015, we were bound to either design peace building interventions using the best available evidence or building in some research and learning into the project. And I think it was towards the end of 2017, early 2018, that we designed a community level conflict prevention and peace building program for DRC and Somalia, drawing on our safety and power outcome areas, the theories of change we had on that, but we ended up adapting it to each context. So now, because we found that the evidence was mixed around, peace building, it was more intergroup dialogues around service delivery. We found that the evidence was mixed on that, so we developed a research and learning component so that we can help contribute to the evidence base on peace building. So the main areas of research and learning focus was on access to services, using health as an entry point in DRC, and using access to justice as an entry point in Mogadishu, in Somalia. And we are, again, interested in under which conditions this can contribute to conflict prevention and positive peace. Now, it's a theory-based evaluation which aims to test the theory of change, the assumptions that we were making, and to determine whether the theory of change we have actually holds true, through which mechanisms and under what conditions. I mean, we know that it's a common assumption that that improved access to services and higher quality of services lead to greater government legitimacy and can make contributions to social cohesion and peace building in fragile states. We hear that statement a lot. So we were interested in carrying out contextually specific research to understand whether and how access to services may or may not contribute to advancing peace building. So explicitly linking service delivery interventions with more traditional conflict resolution interventions through facilitating intergroup dialogues around health services and around access to justice services. We're now in the final year of that program, and the endline evaluation is on the way. We will definitely be making our findings public. Before that, though, I mean, we are seeing some promising results, and of course, we encountered some challenges, some of which I guess in the course of this discussion we will come to. So I'll stop here for now.
Great. No, thanks, Wale. And I think it's fascinating to hear. I mean, IRC is quite known for being an organization very dedicated, and you explained it very nicely to use where there is existing evidence, but if not, to build up a research and learning component. I have one quick question for you before I'm turning to Henriette for a follow-up. So when you said if it doesn't work, you stop. And then if you think about what Ada said about the fact that sometimes there's a J curve, things get worse before they get better. How do you have that dialogue? Should we stop it, or is it just like part of the necessary things getting worse before they get better? Or and to what extent should one then adapt and redesign rather than stop? How is that decision made?
Right. Okay. So
and just very briefly, you just.
Yeah, sure, briefly. So on peace building, so we haven't stopped any intervention around peace building, but we've stopped some interventions in our health programming. So for example, cooking demonstrations, our staff in country programs love it because, they gather people together and all that, but the evidence shows that it just doesn't work to improve nutrition. So we've phased out all the ones that we've already committed to implementing, but we will not design any new nutrition project with cooking demonstration as an intervention, no more, because the evidence is clear it doesn't work. Okay, great. No, thank you for that clarification. And let me now turn to you, Henriette. And you heard the IRC version of, and how they are doing it. Where on this journey is BMZ then, and your reflection on this same question?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Marie, and thanks, Well, for your first thoughts. Well, it's a great opportunity today, to talk and discuss about the findings from 3IE. So it's really We are really grateful about the systematic review and also your findings. And, it's going to be a start now to actually really dig into it and see, what we can use for transitional development assistance. So maybe let me just briefly outline what is transitional development assistance, because it might, not everyone know. So, well, we are a crisis instrument from the BMZ. And we just released our new strategy, which you can find on the BMZ website. And well, the ultimate goal of our instrument is to strengthen resilience of individuals and communities in fragile countries. And we do this in 4 areas of interventions. One is food security. The second is social cohesion, and that's why we are so much interested in evidence in this field. Third field of intervention is disaster risk management, and the 4th one is reconstruction. And of course, we work with strong partners. On the one side, NGOs, UNICEF, WFP, but also GIZ and KfW. And one focus also of our strategy is to strengthen the analytical and evaluation capacities of our partners, to put that into focus, and also to generate more evidence on those fields of interventions. And so I think also this is one answer to your questions. The role of evidence, of course. I mean, if we talk about evidence and informing policy and practice, this is a really crucial element. Of course, we need relevant evidence for us as policymakers. So, we always have to look, when we find evidence, we need to see, is it what can it help us? Is it really, is it relevant in terms of programming? Is it relevant in terms of a strong political question that is involved? But we definitely see the need of more evidence in general, and especially when it comes to fragile countries and fragile contexts, and to generate and to strengthen evidence is really key. So what we also do is we conduct with our partners in our programs, and the programs are multi-year programs, have a multi-sectoral approach. So we conducting impact evaluations, which are of course quite challenging, and in a lot of terms they are also quite expensive. But then of course we also encourage our partners, especially NGOs, to get into more monitoring and evaluation, strengthen the systems, and we're also financing those systems. So I think maybe I stop here and give back to Marie.
Great. No, thank you very much, Henriette. That's a good overview. So you have sort of you're both sort of into doing evaluations, commissioning systematic reviews, so to get more lay of the land, so to speak. But you're also encouraging your partners. So using your role that you're working with partners closer to the ground to use evidence. So from that, so now we talked about an international NGO, and then a sort of bilateral organization, so to speak, German government organization and ministry. And then let me hand it over to you, Tammy, the UN, the Peacebuilding Fund. What is your view on and your experience on the role of evidence in informing policy and practice in the UN and the countries you work with?
Thanks, Marie. Yeah, I mean, similar to the previous speakers, at the Peacebuilding Fund, we also support evaluations both of projects as well as overall programs within a country, our entire country portfolio. In addition to that, we commission thematic reviews as well as synthesis reviews that sort of lump together either on a thematic topic or more systematically on an annual basis for PBF's performance. So, I mean, the question about how we use that data, because I think one thing is, do we have the evidence? And then another thing is, how is it used? And I think there's absolutely way more that could be done with the evidentiary body that we're building. Part of, I think, we can talk about barriers a little bit later, but Ada also kind of indicated there are some quality issues with a lot of the investments that we're making in M&E. But let's bracket that for maybe a little bit later in the conversation. And in terms of the uses for policy within PBF, I mean, I could point definitely to within PBF and PBSO, the Peacebuilding Support Office itself, we absolutely have been drawing on the evidence base from these various sources to inform, for example, our 4-year strategic plan to decide where is our greatest value added or our niche within an increasingly crowded space. And given that we're sort of this kind of weird animal of both a donor as well as internal to the UN. So, for example, evaluations have been unanimous in the role of the PBF in helping to smooth transitions from a peacekeeping mission to a regular country team, for example, and trying to break down those like sort of silos between the more political part of the house and the either development or humanitarian part of the house. And we increasingly are trying to encourage better use of evidence in forming theories of change. This continues to be a struggle, and we can talk about that again a little bit later with some of the other questions. And I think one thing that I do want to mention, though, is that as much as we would love to sort of say all of our decisions are firmly rooted in evidence, at least when it comes to the PBF, part of our decisions are also balanced by political considerations, to be absolutely frank. So where we decide to engage, at what degree, how much funding we determine to put into a space, it is in part taken from conflict analyses and other forms of evidence from studies or evaluation. But if I'm being absolutely frank, it's also the need to sort of consider the political imperative, the political opportunities, the entry points, and the timing is also kind of critical. And that's, I guess, maybe one form of evidence, but it's not just sort of a basic look at what has historically worked or what do we have evidence for in terms of working, because it may be a country where we know that if we did engage, we could probably have terrific outcomes, but we just don't have the sort of political backing to go in at the level that we would need to see those kind of effects. So I'll stop there because that may also kind of segue naturally into some of the barriers.
Yes, thank you very much for bringing that reality. And in fact, I think all three speakers have talked, you're putting slightly different names on it, but that there is I think while I talked about client preferences, and you talk about that political imperative, and of course that is the world that we live in, one of the bigger questions, and I'm not going to reopen that, but maybe to think about in the further discussions we're having is, of course, are they just given, or can these political imperatives, can we go further in informing client preferences and the political imperatives with evidence? Is there something further we can do rather than taking those as as given? But yes, so let me bring in further panelists, and yes, indeed, the next sort of question I'd like to address is on the issue of what are the challenges associated with evidence-informed decision making in the sector. So we'll get to talk to some of that, all of you. Let me start with you, Jörn, on this question.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. It's been a fascinating discussion so far, and I guess my answer is probably kind of resorting some of the issues that in one way or the other have already been mentioned, and try to put them in some order with respect to the challenges question. I mean, the first challenge when we talk about evidence on the use of external interventions, obviously is that we have to accept the fact that whenever we talk about peace building and everything related to issues of war and peace, external support can always only be a tiny part of the puzzle, and most of the heavy lifting always has to be done by the societies themselves. And all the external support can do is find those ways where the needs are maybe the greatest and the opportunities to support existing opportunities within a society are the greatest. And that obviously is hugely challenging, and you can never be sure that you will be successful. You can never be sure that a society itself will be successful, as we know that the risk of falling back into violence is huge in all post-conflict societies. And actually, when we talk about evidence and presenting evidence to policymakers, the attribution of success is a difficulty under these circumstances, as the attribution of failure is a difficulty. I mean, if we do have situations where a perfect program is trying to support social cohesion with some educational exercises and the overall framework is just going in the other direction, then whatever you can find is that the situation overall will get worse, or vice versa, probably. So even a bad program can find an improvement in social cohesion if the overall framework in the country is moving in the opposite direction. So it is really difficult, although obviously these comparative studies, systematic reviews are an important step towards understanding a bit more about these factors and ironing out some of these effects. Still, the numbers we are dealing with, the numbers of countries, the numbers of societies, we are trying to find out these things about, although from a human perspective, they are far too many for scientific purposes. They are often too few to actually be able to tell what is a side effect and what is the actual effect here. Now that's just a first note on let's be honest and truthful about what external support can achieve. And then obviously, whenever we talk about successful interventions, we want to and about turning experience from the past into something in the future, we are in one way or the other talking about making predictions about the future. But the volatile situations that post-conflict societies are in do not lend themselves for easy predictions on what is going to happen, because so many factors again influence the situation. So predictions are extra hard. The evidence we're using can only ever be about the past. There is no certainty about the future, and that makes it easier for policymakers who may not like some of the evidence that is out there, to just brush it aside by saying, "Oh, we don't know. Oh, it's all unpredictable." So as the overall task is so difficult, it's also easier to actually ignore the findings that are out there. Plus then the element that has been mentioned, the political imperatives, the fact that politics is always driven by a myriad of factors and motives. And frankly, building sustainable peace is often just one priority, if at all, and for policymakers in faraway countries that think about what to do in countries that suffer from conflict. So as I mentioned, it's easier sometimes to ignore unpleasant truth because the whole field is so difficult. There's also another element that for policymakers, it's often easier to go down the path of compartmentalization. That organization is dealing with that part of the problem, and that organization is dealing with this part of the problem. Although all the evidence we have now available and have had available for quite some while tell us that more than anywhere in post-conflict societies, all these things are really intertwined, and you cannot just separate health from politics, from conflict transformation among groups, different groups in society, that all these things are very closely intertwined. And if you just say, okay, we have this agency and they are dealing with the humanitarian needs of the people, and then we have that other agency that's doing big politics and they are doing the diplomacy part, and please keep them aside. I mean, we've all seen these policy papers that tell us that's not the way to go. And we've seen them for 2 decades now. The fact that we've seen them for 2 decades and that every other year new policy papers have to be written that actually say the same thing tells us that it's very difficult to actually overcome that temptation of compartmentalization that comes with sometimes with advantages for policymakers, but definitely makes the whole business in inverted commas far more difficult. Maybe if I may, one last sentence, in order to also be a bit self-critical. Obviously, the evidence we are talking about, and we here, and we are certainly guilty as charged, that evidence itself is not always easy to comprehend and actually to sell to policymakers. I mean, the type of evidence that we think is robust and that we need is exactly the type of evidence that, for example, Ada has shown. And then, I mean, using this fabulous table that you showed us, Ada, is something that you can communicate that with Henriette, and she will be able to discuss that with you. But once she talks to her superiors, things get more complicated. And all she can probably do is transfer a part of that message and a part of that certainty and uncertainty to the next level, and then explain it to a minister why we can do a little bit of this, but we can't be sure that it will help, but it's the best guess we can have. That's difficult, and that's probably not a task that we can leave only to those in the administrations, but where we ourselves also have to do our bit. And we all know that's difficult, and we're not always so successful in also transforming our messages into something that policymakers will feel compelled to respond to with their action. That includes obviously also sometimes using the public, because we all know that politicians tend to act more in difficult situations, more when the public is aware of situations, than when their own administrations tell them they should do something.
Great. No, that's a very comprehensive answer. So now I'm going to make just a short summary, I think, of some of the main points, and then ask Wale and Tammy if he has, forgotten anything to his list, and rather than repeat. So you're talking about, definitely that there is a reminder of the sort of marginal sort of achievement that can be, or achievement that can be done with external support. It's a heavy lift, and it's on the countries themselves. Talking about the fact that it's hard to predict the future with evaluations, which are by definition of the past, etc. So there's some issues there. Political imperative, compartmentalization of aid. We've known it forever, sector-wise, etc. From in the funding organizations and in the countries. So there's compartmentalization on several levels. But then, of course, again, evidence that we're presenting. Who's going to understand it, right? It's a great point. And then I think a very good point about the fact that it might be that your little program or intervention within the program might be working, but everything else is going the wrong direction. And are we maybe doing the wrong types of evaluations, or not doing enough of sort of portfolio-wide program, country program-wide evaluations, to see whether sort of incentives are working in the same direction. Does it make sense? So those are lots of things. Wale, what has he forgotten?
No, I mean, Johan was spot on. I will have 2 challenges that I see. Well, I mean, just going back to what Johan was saying, it completely resonates with me. External support can only go so far. If the necessary conditions are not in place internally, then there's nothing you can do externally that's going to move the needle. Then I was also thinking about when he was talking about evidence for policymakers. The question I keep asking is, when we talk about evidence, whose evidence are we talking about? Evidence for who? and to whose benefit is that evidence? It's something that we often don't talk about. Then the compartmentalization as well is also another area. So for example, we hear about the triple nexus, and I like to remind policymakers and practitioners that the people we serve do not live their lives in the boxes of the nexus. They don't wake up in the morning to say, I am going to have humanitarian aid for breakfast. For lunch, I'm going to have development, or for dinner, I'm going to have peace, right? That's not the way their world works. This is a bureaucratic structure that we've created within the aid industry. Okay, to my two challenges that I think is worth flagging. So the conflict prevention and peace building project that we designed 2017-18, there was a problem around the design process at the beginning, and we needed to be flexible and adaptive, and that was very, very key. We had a donor that allowed us to allowed a lot of flexibility. We faced a challenge because of the initial design, which was very generic, based on a global theory of change. Then during the inception phase in DRC and Somalia, and following a detailed, not superficial context analysis, but a detailed context analysis and baseline survey, the project team then realized that each country project instead needed its own context-specific theory of change, which then informed the adaptation to the program design. And we were lucky to be able to do that because the donor was in support of it. They did not hold us accountable to the original log frame that we gave them. They allowed flexibility. The second challenge is, something that Johan was referencing as well, is around linking peace building from a local level, because what we were doing was community level peace building, right? It wasn't subnational or national. Linking that to the broader subnational and national efforts, not least because events, actors, interests at higher levels tend to shape and have impact on local level peace efforts. But still, if I still believe that effective longer term planning by international actors, that relies on the existence of implementation both nationally and locally, connecting those two, and as long as it's locally owned, can help mitigate some of the problems that we find when we talk about political will. Because oftentimes we say there's lack of political will. Well, is there a way we can also design interventions that can begin to change the political calculus that policymakers are making, that politicians are making? I don't think there's enough of that within the sector. And whether we have the leverage to do that or not, again, it depends on specific country context. So this was really a big challenge for us in DRC, where state failure is very prevalent, and often there's that limited political will among national authorities and local elites. Having said that, though, there's still a huge potential for local community-led peace building to have positive impact beyond the local, if it focuses on looking at pro-development and peace building dynamics that aims to counterbalance some of that lack of political will at the higher level. So a sort of strategy that builds social cohesion bottom up. Again, this is an assumption. It's like chipping away some of the conditions that enables political elites to manipulate youth that are probably out of a job, they don't have a future, and the only thing they can do is to pick up a gun. It gives them a source of power and a source of livelihood. So is there a way we can take that off the table so that it's even difficult to recruit soldiers and belligerents in the first place? But again, that's something that it's it might be 35,000 feet thinking, but it's worth exploring.
Great. No, I think that's an excellent point, in the sense of in the way I see the point you're making is around sort of political will is not necessarily given, is something we can sort of build into the way we do programs at the local level, and then sort of build up from there. Let me, one thing that also struck me in what he was talking about is this flexible donor that you mentioned. And with that Tammy, if you have something to say about flexible donors that are happy to fund evidence, and any views on that, but quite briefly, we have to move on.
Yeah, I mean, they are out there. PBF is one of them, as are some of our donors as well. One of the challenges, though, in terms of being a donor and trying to signal that we're open, is that many times, at least for our fund recipients, either their systems are too rigid to take advantage of this kind of flexibility, or there's fear of being the perception of that of failure, and you don't want to either up your own bureaucratic food chain or to the donor have a perception of failing. But I think that this brings me actually to a very brief point that I wanted to make about the challenges of using evidence for decision making. And Marie, you had also, when I was making my intervention before, you kind of wrapped it up by saying, are there ways to try to advocate then for better use of evidence? And for sure there are, but the degree to which someone like me or even the chief of the fund would be willing to really go to the mat to push for a change in policy or an approach with senior level management really depends on a high level of confidence in the kind of evidence that you're bringing. And I think, as Ada, even in her presentation, was pointing out, there are, even within that study, certain studies or evaluations that are better than others. And I think that this question of the quality of the evidence that we are producing points me to two kind of critical factors. One, capacity gaps on the ground, as well as funding gaps on the ground. Because, as you also mentioned, I think in your opening statements, doing this work really does require that funders, donors, are willing to invest in the kinds of data collection that we need to support the kind of systems of reflection that we need to kind of consolidate that learning and analyze and pivot when we need to. And all of this takes money that some, I think, are very squeamish about putting into M&E, because it is perceived as a sort of zero-sum game between a choice of that or supporting more directly with programming conflict-affected communities. And so I think it's this sort of, the quality issue is related precisely, I think, to this issues around capacity gaps and funding concerns. Over.
Excellent. No, I think that's an excellent point, and I think we'll revisit it a little bit more in detail and in terms of the methodological challenges in a second. Just before moving on, Henriette, maybe you can. You've heard. I mean, whenever you ask people about challenges, they start talking about opportunities already. So this panel is already alluding to some of that. But if you could say a few words about promising strategies for promoting more widespread evidence use, and any examples of organizations that, from your perspective, are doing this well.
Well, I mean, I think, most of the points are already mentioned. I mean, it's of course financing. It's and I think, I mean, at BMZ, I think we're quite a way of financing a lot of evaluation, and to also strengthen monitoring and evaluation systems in general. But of course, I mean, especially impact evaluations. I mean, they're so that's one way of strengthen capacities and also and actually producing evidence. Well, of course, communication is quite something. I mean, as we see today, there's a lot of interest in those findings, and I think, as you mentioned, Marie, I mean, you're going to have every month a certain focus on evidence in general. So I think communication between practitioners, but also between practitioners and like administration. That's really key. And also, you know, to learn from evidence and to really implement it into in the programs, and then, you know, to see how theory of change can also be changed. I mean, that's so for the whole cycle of implementing, programming, evaluating, I think, you know, we have to see that as of course as a whole concept. And I think, I mean, at least we try to, you know, to discuss this with all our partners and see what we can do to make it easier for them, be it financing, but also be it on flexibility, as was mentioned. So I think most of the points were raised: flexibility, financing, communication. I don't have a certain example who does it well, but I think, I mean, the latest States of Fragility report from the OECD, you know, is also, it's a great report, and it shows, or they bring together evidence, but also policy recommendations. And I think, I mean, I just read it, and I think it's really good when we talk about fragility in terms of prevention, but also strengthening resilience. So for me, this is a report that brings a lot together.
Great, thank you very much. And I think that very excellent points, among others, also this idea of sort of, you know, we promising strategies must include, you know, how we communicate, and that we can, you know, there are a number of organizations who are spending sort of including 3IE, and a significant amount of time to sort of change, you know, to turn what are probably very hard to understand and grasp reports like, you know, the first version of a systematic review into policy briefs and so on. And I think that's you know, those are some excellent strategies. Now, for a final question before turning to the audience questions, just quite briefly, if possible, what are the methodological challenges associated with producing evidence in the sector, and how can these be best overcome? So let me turn to Jörn, and then Tammy, and then we will wrap up this section after that.
Yeah, very quickly, maybe 4 points. First, financing in programs for evaluations has been mentioned, but it's more than that. I think the first point is that the programs need to build in the possibility of impact evaluation, actually, in terms of providing, making sure the data is available and is collected early on, and often still evaluators come in late in the play and at a stage where it's just where some of the opportunities have already been missed, and that's an easy thing to say, and but I think it's still important to stress. I've seen some progress on this. I think we can just generally say quite some progress has been made on this, but we need to be sure and make sure that that is secure, is being secured. The second element, I think, still is that diverse methods are an asset. But methodological rigor is certainly key, regardless of what method you use. That's also important, and there are sometimes misunderstandings about that. Like quantitative, rigorous impact evaluations are wonderful, but obviously they also come with their own limitations with respect to granularity, accounting for kind of unexpected results that you didn't have in your design ex ante. So qualitative methods are a key complement. But again, if they are rigorous in their use of methodology, and if they make it clear what they can contribute and what their comparative advantage is. And here often there's still too little effort put into the issue of external validity. That is, how generalizable are the findings that we find in this particular case to any other case. It's not a problem that you cannot solve or that you can address. You can address it. Maybe you cannot solve it, but you can address it in many ways. And again, a diversity of methods is the best way of dealing with these issues. And then a third issue, it's a methodological as much as a practical one. Is often the difficult environments are not only difficult environments to act in, but also difficult environments to actually create evidence on. For many reasons, fast changing politics make it more difficult to actually have baselines for anything that you do research on. High vulnerability of people make it virtually and ethically impossible to do experiments, although in some way, in one way or the other, experiments can be a wonderful way of finding whether an intervention works or not, but you don't experiment on highly vulnerable people, obviously. And the high physical insecurity, obviously, is a challenge for anyone who's doing the research in the field. That is, there's less field exposure for evaluators. But then again, I think there's no silver bullet to all these issues, but there are ways of addressing all of them, being aware of them and doing steps towards mitigating their impact. There's an increasing awareness of existing possibilities, alongside also proper ethics of doing this type of research, which is also important. So I think there are several ways, and we see progress both on the side of implementing organizations and on the side of evaluators, research organizations. The final point that I would like to stress is, and I think we still have that as an issue, we found that when we did a systematic evaluation of qualitative research 8 years ago, and I think this is still true in many regards, that evaluations, and also those evaluations that are being commissioned by important donors, they need to transcend a tiny piece of an intervention. If you only commission an intervention that tells you about what does this small program do to this small part of that population, you're very likely to miss the larger picture when we talk about peace building. And just remember, that reminds me of how difficult it is in countries such as Germany and others to actually get all departments, all government ministries around a common understanding of maybe after 20 minutes, it's about time to understand, has our engagement in Afghanistan made a difference? And to get that done has been a massive, tremendous effort without much success, actually. And I think that is a more political issue that has immediate methodological consequences. You can only answer the question that you are actually allowed to pose.
Great. I think you touched upon a number of issues there, everything from the methodological challenges of doing evaluations in this context to a number of the issues around commissioning. That is a whole, debate of its own, and how is that well done to actually promote evidence. I've seen sort of, there's a variety of challenges in that regard. Tammy, anything to add?
Yeah, just a couple of things. I mean, I completely agree with everything that Jonas laying out. But in addition to that, I think, again, I keep referring back to Ada's great presentation. And when she was laying out those sort of list of norms that we're defining, for example, social cohesion, we see part of the challenge, for us at least, is in recognizing that many of the peace building aims that we're trying to measure are kind of like conceptually fuzzy. And so just even trying to get purchase on what social cohesion or trust or tolerance or willingness to work together like practically looks like, and how we can meaningfully measure that is a challenge. And related to that, I think we very often fall back on creating a results framework full of indicators based on perceptions, which then pushes us into just basically doing perception surveys to try to get at our peace building value added. So many of our interventions, of course, as Wale was mentioning too, like health and peace building, or education and peace building, they're putting together sectors plus the peace building aspect. The tendency among our fund users is to, they're experts in those sector fields. So we're going to get really good monitoring and results on on the sector thing, but to try to get at the peace building link, very often it sort of reverts back to, we're going to do a perception survey for that. And we know that perception surveys are extremely hypersensitive to sort of immediate events. So depending on when you're asking somebody, it will be very influenced by what has just recently happened. There's the additional challenge of exactly when you're asking them, what is the staying power of that sort of perception? And this relates to another methodological challenge for creating evidence, which is, we have funding related to our interventions. The Peace Building Fund, it's 18 months, 24 months, 36 months. These are not long time spans in order to try to see the more sort of societal, structural, institutional kinds of changes that we would expect from a peace building result. So, how do you, when your funding is sort of attached to these timeframes, that means your evaluation and your data collection is attached to these timeframes. How do you then try to measure and capture results that may take beyond that period of time? And that brings me back to the funding issue again, and capacity gaps. But I'll stop there because I realize that we're out of time. Thanks very much.
Great. No, thank you very much. I mean, I think those are really nice additions, both in terms of the peace building indicators and the fact that they need to be tailor-made at the same time for systematic review purposes. We'd like them to be measured in similar ways so we can actually come to some sort of overall insights. The timeframes is a hugely important issue, and we struggle with this also in 3IE, for example, where you have the funding for a certain amount of time, etc. But that across sectors, this is not only for this sector, but across sectors, a lot of the impacts will take longer than the funding, so to speak, allows for.
Yeah. As well as the other problem of you may actually get good immediate results, or at least indications that things are moving in the right direction, but it may also be fleeting, and you won't be able to pick that up either.
Exactly. So the longer term curves is what we need to get to some of those measurements. Let me now move to the audience. You've been very patient. I've gotten a few curated questions through here, and so let me start with a question from Cheyenne Sharbatke Church. It's not addressed to anyone specifically, so you'll get each a turn to see which ones you pick. There is a long-standing methodology in the peace building community that donors won't pay for good program evaluation, yet some strong statements of commitment from the panelists. What is your position on reasonable percentage range, e.g. 8 to 12% of program budgets to be allocated to M&E for NGOs? That's the first question. Then there's a question from Tobias Zeher, which is for Ada. Could you reflect on the notion that a strong focus on social cohesion, as defined by the 5 dimensions mentioned, might even hamper processes of conflict transformation, as they do not address the potential of conflicts to change and make progress on social challenges dividing groups? For example, transforming stereotypes. It's more a question of how existing conflicts are carried out instead of washing them away through aiming for social cohesion. Then there's a question, again from Cheyenne, to all panelists. It would be interesting to hear the panelists reflect on the right balance between innovation and evidence, when to rely on the evidence and when to be comfortable to innovate and develop new approaches that do not have evidence. There's a question from Kay Abbott, addressed to the whole panel. When I hear the oft-used term resilience, it sounds as though donors now are trying to help people hold out and cope on their own. Parentheses, may be fine in certain disaster scenarios, instead of cooperating to devise solutions, especially in conflict resolution. If donors and their foreign policy departments work together, couldn't there be durable solutions, especially through the UN or EU? And a final question so far, and I guess that's all we'll have time for. A question from Som Nirola to Ada. I'm interested to know more about the impact of the peace education in building solidarity and trust as transforming the society at large. I fully agree that it needs long-term support for peace education. However, there are several universities now started to run the peace building courses. Do you see the possibilities or high impact on investing on peace education? Sorry, there's one more question. I'll add this. This is from Wale, to Wale from K. Abbott. Wale, why would you think the conflict in Somalia or DRC are about lack of access to services, or that improved services provided by outside agencies would decrease conflict and increase trust in governments? All right, so now let me start with you, Ada, and then we'll go around and you will address what you would like to address on these questions.
Thanks, Marie. Great question. So there were a lot of other good questions from people that I tried to respond to within the chat. So people do look at the Q&A section, because maybe there are some questions there that I answered that you should be able to see the answers to. But for these two questions, so to the first regarding how the 5 dimensions might hamper a process of conflict transformation, it's hard to just answer that question point blank. You know, my instinct is to say, let's have a conversation about this, because I think it's a really challenging question. We certainly didn't want to suggest that by building social cohesion, you could solve the question of sustainable peace. You know, we don't want to say that social cohesion is equivalent to sustainable peace. It's just one of the building blocks. And so when it comes to conflict transformation, there are ways in which building or addressing different dimensions of social cohesion can be helpful in terms of creating and fostering a willingness to participate, building trust across divides. And those can ultimately help move us to a space where conflict transformation may be possible. But this is why one of the key findings of the review is that these types of interventions alone are insufficient for this process as a whole. And so we don't want to say that we can wash anything away with social cohesion. It cannot be the be all and end all of a strategy, but it's sort of one piece of the puzzle, is the way that I think about it. Regarding the question on the impact of peace education, so one of the interventions, or 2 of them that we included in the review, did take place at a university, but it's interesting because I'm not sure from your question if you're referring to courses about peace building in terms of how to build peace, of which there are many nowadays, but I'm not aware of impact evaluations of those courses themselves. What we included in the review there were a couple interventions that took place at a university, but it was still a process of facilitated dialogue between 2 groups. So it seems more that the impact evaluations are of interventions where people have taken what they might have learned in higher education around peace building and conflict resolution and conflict transformation, and then tried to apply it in the real world. But we didn't look for kind of education interventions trying to measure the impact of a particular university course. So I'll hand it back to you, Marie.
Yeah, thank you, Ada. Let me hand over to you, Henriette.
Well, thanks. Maybe I just pick the resilience one. Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, okay, solving those conflicts would be the best option. Yes, but we at the moment, we look at a lot of fragile contexts that we call protected crises. And I think it's really helpful, at least to see what people need, how we can strengthen their resilience. It's not individual, but also communities and, you know, local level. And in order to cope better, I mean, natural disasters, of course, that's a very relevant factor. But as I said, protected crises are reality at the moment. So I think besides conflict resolution and try to find long-term solutions for those crises, yes, that's right. But we also need to tackle the reality that we see today. The other question on percentage of M&E monitoring and evaluation, I don't want to say 8 or 12%. Yes, I think at least BMZ as a donor, German government, I think we can talk about those, or we want to strengthen the capabilities of the NGOs especially, and also promote evaluation and evidence generating. So I think we would need to, discuss whether it's 8 or 12%. I don't want to pinpoint that now, but thanks again.
I think we should come out with a number from this.
I can give you a number.
Okay, so Wally, you got a direct question on some of your presentation. So why didn't you go next?
Okay, yes, I will. So Kaya, but that very good question. I don't claim to say that the problems in Somalia and DRC is all about lack of access to services. This is a community-based peace-building project, and the context analysis that we did in DRC was in Tanganyika province. So it was the conflict between the Tuareg and the Bantu. And the key thing there was marginalization of the Tuareg from accessing services. So that was why the entry point was access to health. In Somalia, it was in Mogadishu, in 2 districts in Mogadishu. The conflict analysis we did also indicated that part of the big problem you have in those 2 districts in Mogadishu are issues around access to justice that is seen to be fair, right, between various clans. That was why we targeted access to justice. And the other question you asked around, whether external actors can just, come in and, save the world. No, we actually worked with local institutions. So in DRC, we worked with the Ministry of Health. We worked with what they call the CODESAs. The CODESAs are like the local health committees in the community that are, aligned with the ministry. In Somalia, we work with the courts. We work with the district commissioner's office. We work with the police, and we work with the clan elders, because in Somalia, you cannot discount the informal justice system. So we worked with all those local stakeholders. I will just quickly respond to the question on percentage of that donors put into research. Credit to CEDA, who funded the conflict prevention and peace building project. They gave us 20% for learning. So 20% of the overall program budget was dedicated to learning. And that is what has really, really helped us to do meaningful evaluation of the project.
Great, we have a new number. Let me go to you, Tammy.
Thanks. Actually, I'll address 2 questions that are, I think, kind of linked. One, there was a question about what to do, to what degree can donors really get behind innovation when there's a lack of evidence. And as the Peace Building Fund, anyone who reads our strategic communications things, we're all about trying to support innovation. We see it as, I think, also us embodying the space of being a risk-taking donor. For me, the not having the evidence then puts the onus on having a much better thought out, at least considered, theory of change to really be clear. What are the assumptions that you are really basing this kind of innovative, unsure kind of thing? And then how do we build a monitoring framework and data collection to test routinely to see whether those assumptions are holding? So we're willing to do that, but then you're kind of held to a little bit of a higher standard for how you go about doing your sort of monitoring, data collection, analysis, and then ideally context adaptive programming so that you're flexible and nimble to accounting for change. That, however, we've done that a couple times and I've gotten burned almost every single time because we provide the sort of flexibility up front. But when it comes to implementation, and this again, capacity gaps, when it comes to implementation, I think the field as a whole, whether because of institutional drivers or just conceptual sort of gaps, we're not very good at trying to use that information to adapt and to change. And so we haven't actually seen the follow through when we have given the kind of space to do this. And that brings me to Cheyenne's question also about the percentages. So, I mean, at PBF, we set a actually more modest 5 to 7% of projects. And it's not, that's not a ceiling, that's a floor. We'd be delighted if people were actually carving out 20% of their budgets to do the kind of really underpinning research and data collection. But we have challenges even getting our fund recipients to follow through on their commitment of 5 to 7%. So we often see, and this comes back to the issue of the weak evaluations, by the time it comes to evaluation, they've burned through a lot of the funding, and there's just not very much left to do robust evaluation at the end. Just one last shout out to Germany, actually, that we are now developing a project to test with hopefully 3IE and ISDC, the possibility of doing some impact evaluation within PBF and sort of testing that both to see what kind of evidence we can do, but also to test the viability of doing this on a more regular basis using the kind of capacities and funding that we have. Thanks.
Great, and before turning to Jörn, and I think this is a great point. I think the question raised and your answer around, this idea whether adapt or scrap and innovate, right? It's a very interesting question, and one of the things we need for that, and this is one of the main areas of sort of where 3IE is now focusing a lot of our innovative efforts, so to speak, is how do we get more cost analysis as part of impact evaluations? Very briefly, Ada, did you see any cost analysis in any of the evidence that you accumulated?
Not many. We did find 5 or 6 studies, I forget off the top of my head, that reported some cost data, but we were not able to run any kind of cost benefit analysis. Most of the time, the data presented was kind of back of the envelope, really high level. It cost this much overall, roughly this many people participated. So that's definitely a research gap.
And this is something we're finding across a lot of sectors, but I think in a sector where it's so key that we do what is, has the most promise, I think, and rather than sort of continue doing something that works marginally, if we have the cost attached to it, some of the decisions would be, no, actually, we need to think totally new. It's not just enough just to have a small impact. Anyway, Jörn, you get the last word from the panel. We're a little over, but not very much.
Yeah, I'll address 3 issues. One is the issue of budgeting for evaluations. I liked it very much the way Wally put it, because he didn't say 20% for evaluations, he said 20% for learning. And I think that is so crucial. And that is part of an issue that money in itself will not solve. That obviously there is always the issue of learning on the one hand and accountability to the agency that gave you the money on the other. And the two do not always nicely go hand in hand. At least it can be a tension. And far more important than, well, you do need the money, you do need the funding, but what you also need is the trust that a truthful evaluation is what is wanted, and that there is a culture of learning, not only in the organization that is spending the money, but also in the organization that is giving the money, because then you can expect to actually get true results that help you learn. So I think that's also crucial. I don't have figures on that. Second issue is the challenging question, and Ada already responded to it. Conflict, isn't that something, I paraphrase it, isn't that something that every society has? So should we just live with conflict rather than trying to have social cohesion that gives the impression there is no conflict? I think that indeed would be a misunderstanding. The issue is not to say that with social cohesion there is no conflict. At least there should be less violent conflict. But obviously there are all kinds of conflict in societies that actually are not just a part of it. They need to be existing in order also to get things in societies innovate, move. But social cohesion is in some degree, even across different groups, is probably necessary to actually have a basic understanding of what are the rules of the game of conflict. So how do you deal with conflicts? Do we have a common understanding? And I think we see right now in societies that have prided themselves in being the beacons of stability for many decades, that having very divisive societies where you increasingly lack the social cohesion can actually even drive the most stable societies apart at some point, when there is no longer an agreement about how to deal with conflicts. And we have that in many Western societies in increasing ways. And that leaves me with the word on resilience. I think Henrietta's basically said everything about this. Just maybe one final word from my side on this. If resilience is meant as an excuse not to support anyone, then that is definitely a misunderstanding. But if we say we should just not build on people's resilience, but solve their problems for them, I'm sure that will fail.
I was muted. Excellent final words from Jörn there as well. And I think just really appreciate the high level of questions and good questions that came into the panel. Good, excellent presentation and just really good engagement. I'm sure there's many more questions you might not have gotten the responses to, but we have the log, and so we will try to get your responses on the side if it hasn't been answered already in the Q&A. So as our panelists have highlighted, and I think all of you may probably be aware as well, but producing and using evidence in contexts of fragility can be very challenging. At the same time, you've seen, just from what we've been speaking about in this panel and hearing from various institutions, that there is an increasing number of organizations that are sort of increasingly committed to take evidence on board and further bring learning into their organizations. And I think as a final sort of word of hope, so to speak, and caution, but is that we cannot afford to assume that all programs work without testing these assumptions, because frankly, the cost of ineffective and failing programs is simply too high. We can actually be damaging, processes and hurting rather than doing the good that we are so often assuming that we're doing and wanting to do with the funds. So with that, I'd like to bring this excellent panel and thank each of you for the contributions. Thank the participants, and also please provide us. This was the first. This was a pilot, not a Netflix pilot, but a 3IE pilot of a series. And so, if you have inputs to us on how you'd like us to change the format for the next ones, please send them these suggestions to us, and we would be really, we would like this to be sort of something that influences how people think about the use of evidence in your daily lives and in policy making. So thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. Have a good rest of your evening or morning, as it were.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. Take care.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you very much, everyone.